I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming online.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the characters and plot to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back
Relax
and enjoy Stream On. Today, we'll be reviewing High Rise, streaming on Tubi.
It is the 1970s, and Dr. Lang has just moved into a new luxury high-rise. Over the course of the next few months, the inhabitants of the building break into class-driven tribes and isolate themselves from the world. Will Lang pick a side? And will anyone survive life in the high-rise?
High Rise is directed by Ben Wheatley and written by Amy Jump. It's based on the 1975 novel High Rise by JG Ballard. The film stars Tom Hiddleston as Lang, a doctor that lives on the 25th floor, Jeremy Irons as Royal, an architect of the high rise that lives in the penthouse, Sienna Miller as Charlotte, a well connected single mom that lives on the 26th floor, Luke Evans as Wilder, an activist trying to fight the injustice of the floor class system that lives on the lower floor, and Elizabeth Moss as Helen, Wilder's very pregnant wife, who also lives on the lower floors with him. So, Jeff, you chose this one. What made you pick High Rise?
I'm a fan of Ballard. I love pretty much everything that I've read that he's written, and I read most of his work, not everything, but most of it. I enjoyed High Rise, the book, one of his better novels, not his best. I would say Crash is probably the best work as far as novel length fiction from Ballard, but I enjoyed High Rise, and I was interested to see what they could do with that because the book struck me as unfilmable. I was interested to see if a group of talented actors and behind the scenes people could take this novel, which dips very deeply into surrealism, and make it work on the screen.
So, did you think it was unfilmable because it had a lot of surreal elements to it?
Yes, I thought the surreal elements would not translate well, primarily because of the context that they're presented in. This gets into an issue with trying to adapt for the screen a book that creates a surreal world within the context of an otherwise very real world. With High Rise, we are supposed to accept that everybody just goes insane at the same time. No one leaves this building. Everybody just breaks down to tribes and starts killing each other. Ballard does this in a few other of his novels. There's the book he wrote right before this, Concrete Island, which has the protagonist trapped in like a little green space in the midst of an intersection for a number of like interstates, and he can't escape. Now, clearly, in the real world, you could get out. Within the context of the book, though, it actually works because you get that sense of how the protagonist is reacting to these things, and you don't have a visual reality created for you. And that gets to the problem with this movie. In a book, short story, any kind of written fiction, you get to leverage the imagination of the reader, especially when it comes to creating an environment. You don't have to describe every little thing that's going on for the reader to fill those blanks in. In a film, that visual environment is presented to the viewer. When it comes to a surreal setting like High Rise, having that grounded reality presented to the viewer and coupling that with the lack of being able to get real insight into the inner lives of the characters that you can get with, you know, the written word. I think a good example actually occurs right at the beginning of the story. The opening of the movie and the book are similar. In both, all the events leading to the breakdown of social organization and the tribalization, the violence, and all that has taken place. The lead up to that occurs later in the book. So a lot of it's told in flashback. In the book, it starts like this, and I'm just going to quote a couple of sentences. Later, as he sat in his balcony eating the dog, Dr. Robert Lang reflected on the unusual events that had taken place within this huge apartment building during the previous 3 months. Now that everything had returned to normal, he was surprised that there had been no obvious beginning, no point beyond which their lives had moved into a clearly more sinister dimension. As a reader, you're thrust into a world where your main character, a doctor, is sitting on his balcony eating a dog and thinking about how things had gotten there. In the movie, you're shown all of this. And because you're shown it, I think it actually has less of an impact. I guess let's start with that. Do you think that there is an inherent advantage that a writer has when presenting this basic kind of scenario of something really weird and out of the ordinary and very surreal, very bizarre, happening in what otherwise seems to be a normal world?
Yes, because the writer has the power to go inside someone's head. And in filmmaking, you can't get inside someone's head in the same way, right? You can visually show what someone might be thinking in their head, but it's not the same as a writer being able to do that with words describing thoughts. I think that the mind is inherently a bit surreal, right? So being able to show surrealism through words on a page and how the mind is thinking about it, it's told from like the inner viewpoint of someone's storytelling ability. You get like that point of view character from within someone's mind, versus in the film you don't have a you're not necessarily following just Lang's point of view. You're following many people's points of view as the chaos unfolds. So yeah, I mean, it didn't translate well into film. Like, this film was a hot mess, and I think there are some films that do surrealism well. Like, we think Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind gets very surreal, right? What dreams may come when you're seeing what heaven and hell might look like gets kind of surreal, and those films work. But this one did not. um, I would say one of the biggest reasons that to me this film didn't work is something you brought up, is that it's not believable the way that the film tells the story. There's a huge plot hole. So in terms of believability, like I get they're trying to do this exercise in dystopian surrealism, but it was really hard for me to go there and accept that all these educated people that are portrayed as middle to upper class living in this experimental high rise building with shared gyms and shopping and all that stuff are so disconnected from the outside world that they would devolve this quickly into murder and orgies and animalistic chaos. Like, they became like so consumed with their own little class system of the higher floors meaning higher class. And if they were stuck in this building with no ability to get out, then I could believe it more. But they got out. I mean, this film has many scenes where these people are going to work in the outside world. And like, they're going to their cars in the parking lot and then driving to their offices and performing their normal work duties. Like, Dr. Lane goes to his office, right? And you see Wilder go to his office at a news station he works at. I mean, so they have enough other influence that you think it would, like, why wouldn't they just leave the building? Like, if, for example, like if you didn't think it was fair, Wilder and Helen, that couple, right? Like, that you were stuck on the lower floors. Why not just leave and live somewhere else? Like, it didn't, it was like these people were locked in the building, but they weren't. The film showed them leaving all the time to do things. So it would have worked better if, like a Lord of the Flies, which has sort of a similar feel, right? Of like a rank structure and devolving into chaos and all that, like that works better because everyone's stuck on an island together, but and with no outside reality to balance them because they're all on the island. But this had an outside reality shown multiple times, and I think that's why I struggled with the plot, because of that giant plot hole of the outside world that these people went to daily.
Surrealism can work in films. You can either do something like Buñuel's Un Chien Andalou, which is a surrealist movie, but there is no standard narrative structure. That movie is basically a bunch of very tenuously connected sequences. You can also do it in certain more realistic contexts. For example, the movie Snowpiercer, which actually addresses some of the themes in high rise, particularly class warfare, but it does it in a setting where there is no real world. It's in a train rolling through a post apocalyptic wasteland. So the characters can't leave. And even the some of the scenes in that film that are not very realistic, like one of the train cars near the front where the upper class lives is a sauna, which seems like an odd use for a train car, but it works in the context of the movie. This film, and this goes back to exactly what you were saying about showing a grounded world outside of the high rise, makes it much harder to accept that the things we are seeing could reasonably take place.
Right. I mean, you have all these educated people, a doctor, a dentist, teacher, filmmaker, newscaster, architect, like all these people living in this crappy building with a shitty power grid. Like, why wouldn't they just move out to a better building? There was no, they weren't forced to be in that building. I mean, maybe you could argue that they had paid their rent for the year and they didn't want to lose out on money, but some of these people made a lot of money, so it wouldn't be a big issue to lose out on some of their whatever deposit and rent. Like, it just, it would have worked so much better if you put it in a post-apocalyptic setting where they were stuck in the building and going outside the building would, you know, kill them because of whatever is outside the building, mutant creatures or the air quality or virus or aliens or whatever. Like, pick your poison of those types of movies. And if they were trapped in this building, then I would have believed this much more than having that outside world to balance things out. And in the book, did they have that outside world to balance things out, or did they not really show that?
There is an outside world in the book. It's just the book really gets into the kind of collective madness of everyone. But because you can see inside the character's head, it's easier to accept it. At least I found it easier to accept that. In this case, because you don't really get insight into what's motivating the characters other than what they're saying, it's a lot harder to just kind of accept that everyone is going to buy into what's happening in the high rise. That, as you said, no one's going to leave, no one's going to report this to the authorities. In the context of a book, it is easier to accept that because you do get that insight into the characters, as well as the author being able to talk directly to you. and say, here is why these things are happening. Whereas in a film, that is more tenuous, and big part of the communication between the creator, or in the case of a film, creative team, and the viewer is pretty much already set. So, because of those limitations that a filmmaker has and how they're going to talk to their audience, how they're going to convey things to the audience, I think it's harder to get people to accept situations like this and behaviors like this outside of the context of a film genre that has that built in suspension of disbelief already there. Hence the reason a movie like Snowpiercer can get away with weird stuff, because it's a post apocalyptic science fiction dystopia. So the viewers are already expecting weird things and odd behavior.
Yeah, Snowpiercer worked because it's not set in the real world as we know it.
It didn't help that there are some sequences in this film that also just don't even work visually. A lot of this film looks interesting. There are a lot of interesting images and some good visual sequences, but there are some things that are mystifying as to how they made it into the final cut. I'm specifically thinking of a slow motion dance sequence. Now, there are two of them in the film, and the first one is at a party in one of the lower floors. So it's like the middle class people getting together at the party. The Wilder character has beaten up the bodyguard for the architect who designed and built this complex. And Dr. Lang comes in. At first, he seems concerned for this guy who's beaten up, even though the bodyguard, had bullied Lang repeatedly during the course of the film. But then, as Wilder starts dancing, and Lang at first is just kind of standing there looking in disbelief, but then eventually just starts wildly dancing too. And it's done in like slow motion, and the lighting changes. So it's basically the rest of the crowd is kind of lost in the shadows. That sequence worked because it's supposed to be a tipping point for Lang when he's leaving behind some of the expected behaviors, and you're going to be able to get more into how he is becoming more feral, I guess. The second one, though, is at a party in the penthouse. So it's the upper class and they're dancing. I don't know why the sequence is there. And it ends with a bunch of close ups of people staring passively into the camera, most of whom I didn't recognize because they're not main characters. And it just goes on and on. The other, there's another extended sequence that really bugged me, and I'm interested to see what you think of it because I know you like montages. There is a montage in this movie that is supposed to take care of the majority of the breakdown of society and the rise of floor based tribes in the space of about 90 seconds, which bugged me because this is where all the interesting stuff is happening, and we don't really get to see how it happens. What did you think of that?
So there were multiple montage scenes in this film. I mean, that being one of them, where I just felt like I was in a bad drug trip. Like they were poorly done. And I like montage scenes generally, but I just got tired of watching multiple scenes of the tenants devolving into chaotic animalistic behavior because the power went out. I mean, it's like the power starts going wonky and they just lose it and go crazy. They have, murder, orgies, blood, the garbage is piling up, violence over and over and over again. The weird dance scene, like I just none of it was cohesive. and it just felt gratuitous and it wasn't enjoyable to watch. It didn't do anything other than, yeah, it sort of like crowbars you about what they're trying to say, which the allegory I think they're trying to get across in this movie is unregulated capitalism creates this Lord of the Flies environment where people just devolve into class warfare and chaos. But I felt that they were hitting us over the head with this allegory. Like, do you agree that was the primary allegory of this film, is about the dangers of like a libertarian form of unregulated capitalism?
I can see that interpretation. I went a little broader and just thought this was more of a standard class warfare story. The one twist being, instead of your kind of stereotypical working class versus the upper class, this was the middle class versus the upper class. I think the only working class character in the film who has any real important position is probably the housekeeper for the architect, and mostly because near the end of the film, she provides Wilder with the gun that he uses to shoot the architect. But basically, it's about a bunch of doctors and middle managers and, you know, people involved, like in the TV industry, all deciding to go to war with the people they work for. It just was presented in a way that wasn't particularly engaging. I think this movie would have benefited from a more linear plot and a more solid plot and focus on a smaller group of characters, but also tone down some of the weirdness, not make it so extreme near the end.
Yeah, and I think they use the weirdness for, what I'm calling the allegorical crowbar, where they're hitting you over the head multiple times with this class warfare and the divide between the middle class on the lower floors, the upper middle class on the middle floors, like Dr. Lang's character is like sort of upper middle class, and then the upper or the wealthy on the top floors, and that the gap widens over film, and they just hit you over the head with the problems of not regulating capitalism and the widening gap between the middle and upper class, and then the chaos, and I just got so tired of them crowbarring their allegory into this film. It wasn't subtle. You didn't naturally bake it into the story. Like, it started off like it could be with, him moving into the floor and this bit of back and forth between the floors, and people talking about, oh, what floor are you on? Like, it worked at first, but then it just quickly devolved. um when we didn't need so many of those weird orgy montage blood scenes.
By the end of the movie, the building is a war zone. There are bodies all over the place. There's a pool in the building, and there are just corpses floating in it. People have set up campfires in the halls and things. You could have taken this source material and the idea of a sort of self contained community and look at how class differences that to an outsider might seem fairly superficial. How much of a difference is there between a middle manager and upper manager other than, pay scale, right? You're all white collar people and all that. But use that to kind of examine those differences and those tensions. But giving into the kind of open warfare and barbarism and weirdness, I think it lost a lot of the potential that story has. And I would assume you agree given what you said.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, even a strong cast of actors couldn't save this film. It's unfortunate, right? maybe with a different script or direction, they could have done something with this, especially if they had plopped it into a dystopian setting. That could have helped. But this film, it was a train wreck from start to finish in my mind. And then it had such a strange ending. Like it ended with, I'm so curious what you think of this ending. It ended with a Margaret Thatcher speech. And here's what they have her saying. There is only one economic system in this world, and it is capitalism. Where there is state capitalism, there will never be political freedom. What are your thoughts about bringing Margaret Thatcher and that speech into this movie?
Oh, it was a complete misfire. I thought it actually did not speak very well to what I thought the themes of the story were, which was a broader idea of how the middle and upper classes interact and loathe each other. So taking that standard class warfare story, but focusing on kind of the groups that in a standard story might be lumped together as just the successful non-working class people versus the working class. I didn't get as much of the specific critique of an economic system in the rest of the movie. Because I didn't get that and didn't really read that into the film, that little tack on, that little add on coda with Margaret Thatcher seemed out of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, I hated it, even though I thought this film was a critique on unregulated capitalism, like a very libertarian form of capitalism. That bringing Margaret into it, it just this film, even though they sort of set it in the real world, it's in a bit of an alternative universe, right? And so to then bring Margaret into it puts it very much in the actual world in the 1980s, right? And that just it already had problems with the surreal elements of this film, and that made it even worse when you brought that in. And we didn't need that. It didn't add any value to the film, just what trying to hammer the point home again. And it depends on the point you take from the film, right? You took a different point from the film, and having read the book, that probably helps. Like it informs what you're thinking this film is about already, since you've read the original source material. I have not read the source material, but I felt like I knew what the director was trying to say because it got crowbarred in. So yeah, it's just very disappointing. Like if you're gonna do a surreal story, make the entire world that way. Like a better example of a film that's weird and has an allegory, but does a good job staying within the surreal elements is The Lobster. I don't know if you've seen that film, but it's this surreal dystopian movie. It stars Colin Farrell and Rachel Weisz, and it's an allegory on the social rules that govern romantic relationships in society. And you have these single awkward people that haven't been able to fall in love yet, so they're all put in a building together, and they have 45 days to fall in love, or they'll be turned into an animal. And it has like strange rules and rituals and things like that, just like High Rise does. And there's an attempt to sort of rage against the machine of that system. But the reason Lobster works is because the whole world is set up to agree with that structure, that single people that can't get coupled after a certain time end up being put in this building and they have to fall in love or they turn into an animal. Like that's part of the existing outside world too. And does a better job with the sort of that Black Mirror type of story. It's not crowbarred, it's just sort of naturally, like everyone just accepts these are the rules, and then you see the people trying to fight that underlying system. Versus High Rise, it's like you're operating in two different worlds, the world inside the building and then the outside world that seems very normal, to include a Margaret Thatcher speech. And I think that was the problem. It didn't ground you right into the surrealism.
Well, that's why I think the adaptation of Crash, the David Cronenberg film, works better because in both book and film, you're dealing with this like cult of people who fetishize auto accidents, but they exist in a very real world, and you can believe that there's this like little underground of people who are devotees of this very kind of out there kink. It doesn't take any real suspension of disbelief to think, oh, people like this could at least, in theory and the context of the story, exist. This has that problem of how do you, shoehorn in this world into what is presented as externally a real world. It can be done. The Lobster sounds interesting. I have not seen that. I will seek that out, but that's like in the context of a science fiction world, right?
Yeah, it's sort of a surreal dystopian world. It reminds me of a Black Mirror episode.
Okay. I was thinking of another film. This is another David Cronenberg film called Shivers. And it's also known as They Came From Within. And it's one of the movies he made in the 1970s, so one of his early films. It too is set in this sort of self contained apartment complex. This one is outside of Toronto. And the theme for that has more to do with looking at the sexual revolution as seen through David Cronenberg's very odd lens. In the case of that movie, it involves a bunch of parasites that turn their hosts into basically sex addicts, and it spreads throughout this apartment complex. You can believe the kind of isolation there because externally these people seem the same. They are, you know, not hunting dogs down in the hallways or anything like that. It seems normal. It's just what they're doing is abnormal. So it can work. And I even think that looking at a single building class warfare could actually work, even if it's not in some sort of, dystopian um, post apocalyptic world or anything like that. You just have to craft it carefully. A real world setting where the people who are locked into this little society don't have any place else they can go and no one else they can turn to.
Right, and then they just added too many weird elements, like the horse living on the top of the building in the penthouse, and the wife, I don't know, walking around like little Bo Peep, just odd things. And you had these just weird fantasy scenes, like you had one with Lang, and he has a dream with flight attendants in it. Like there was so many odd scenes that didn't make sense and blend together. So I think toning that weirdness down and telling a story of just the divide and the widening divide between the middle, upper middle, and upper class could have worked if you wanted to put it in the real world, but you would have to have toned down the weirdness and the surreal elements of it to do that.
So, is there anything else about this plot that you want to get into, or should we proceed to our wrap up?
No, let's proceed to the wrap up.
Okay, so what scene did you like the best?
So I struggled to find one because I really did not like this movie. But the one I decided on ultimately was there's a sex scene between Lang and Charlotte on the 26th floor balcony of her apartment. It's very sensual. He's making out with her, and at one point he's holding her out over the balcony. Tom Hiddleston's nice to look at. He and Sienna Miller had good chemistry in that scene, And I like that Charlotte was portrayed as this take charge woman once she had gotten her pleasure out of the moment. And Lang's like, you're going already? I thought we were going to do this. Like, she's like, basically, she gets the sex and then she's leaving. And he's like, wait a minute. I thought we were going to like talk and bond. And Charlotte says, we're done. And Charlotte says, you look much better without your clothes on. You're lucky. Not many people do. And she's like, we've done it. That's it. And she leaves. And so I just like that, like, female empowerment moment, almost like she was using him. And the sex scene was nice. So that's what I picked as my favorite scene. It was a struggle to find a good one in this film. What about you, Jeff?
Well, my favorite scene actually does involve the horse. I like the entire first meeting between Lang and the architect. I thought that Hiddleston and Jeremy Irons, who plays the architect, they have some really nice dialogue together. There's some of the class issues going on, particularly with the architect's wife and the bodyguard and how they act with Lang, but it's not over the top. There's a pretty funny sequence where we get some of the revolt of technology theme, which does run through this film, where Lang is trying to, step up and repair some wall mounted like intercom and manages to completely destroy it, and then just kind of hands it to the architect's wife and is like, oh well, it's broken, and like kind of walks off. Even the introduction of the horse is kind of funny because Lang reacts to it like it's weird. He's like, you is that a horse? And the architect is basically like, yeah, I guess it's my wife's thing. If that had been the tone of the rest of the movie. So a little bit of weirdness, like the horse, or as you mentioned, the architect's wife being kind of dressed up like Little Bo Peep, bits of weirdness like that. I believe the whole film would have worked better. What would you say is your least favorite scene, or were there just far too many to pick from?
There are far too many. Like, again, I think this movie is an absolute train wreck, but normally I love montage scenes, especially when they're set to like a good soundtrack. But in this movie, I could not stand them. There were multiple montage scenes of people acting a fool, like they were chaotic animals because the lights started to flicker in the building. It got repetitive. It was an eyesore. Like, oh, more blood, more orgy, more people dancing strangely. It lost its effect. It was way overdone. And frankly, I found it boring after a while. So, yeah, just left a really bad taste in my mouth. What about you?
I actually agree with you. Those were my least favorite sequences in the film, with the exception of that first dance scene I talked about before. But the rest of them were, at best, distracting, and at worst, lazy storytelling. So, yeah, I could have done without almost all of them. So, Steph, what is your final panda rating? Out of five pandas, how many want to live in this high rise?
Not even a panda. This is the film I have rated the lowest of all the films we reviewed to date. I gave it point 0.5 pandas. This to me was just a hair better than my zero panda benchmark movie, which is Battlefield Earth. I mean, this watch it at the 22-minute mark to see the steamy sex scene with Tom Hiddleston if you like to look at him. But otherwise, this movie is so bad. Incongruent plot, disjointed montage scenes, it just got painful to watch, and I just kept waiting for it to end. Go watch an episode of Black Mirror instead if you want to see like a surreal film, or watch The Lobster. I would do a hard pass on this film. What about you, Jeff?
So I gave it two pandas. I thought it was an interesting failure. It has some good parts. I thought some of the imagery was fine. Hiddleston's acting is okay. Definitely had a potentially good story because of the source material. Unfortunately, it's too disjointed to recommend. It's just far too much of a mess. This is a case where the book can get away with a lot more than a film can. Anyway, that's it for High Rise. Thank you for joining us. Join us next week when we'll be checking out Wind River, currently streaming on Amazon. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Wrights Media. Reproduction without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2021.